Great, thanks. So we're going to get started. I'm going to give a very brief introduction and then turn it over to our speaker. Welcome to everybody to the Future of Law, Technology, and Governance workshop series hosted by the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. I am the host and moderator, Mike Madison. I am a professor at the University of Pittsburgh Law School, and I moderate these workshop discussions. So thanks to everybody for being with us today. I want to give a special welcome and thanks today to my colleague and friend, Dr. Lisa Parker, who is a member of the faculty at the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health and also with an appointment at the School of Law. Lisa is the director of the Center for Bioethics and Health Law at the University of Pittsburgh. And today's speaker, Valerie Racine, is a direct product of an earlier conversation between me and Lisa about how to combine her center's interests and her interests and mine. So Valerie is here thanks to the contributions of Lisa. So thank you, Lisa, for helping to bring Valerie to us today. I will turn it over to Valerie in just a moment. Procedurally, we're going to have a presentation for about 30 minutes, at which point I will moderate a Q&A until the top of the hour. If you can see the slides, you can see the title of Valerie Racine's talk, Can Blockchain Solve the Dilemma in the Ethics of Genomic Biobanks? Valerie is trained in the history and philosophy of science. She is a philosopher and bioethicist and was formerly on the faculty at Western New England University, but she is now sort of post-academic for the time being, having launched herself in a novel direction career-wise and geographically. And she can explain that if she wants as part of the conversation, but I think that's enough to get us started. So welcome to Valerie. Thank you for being with us today, and I will mute myself and turn things over to you.
Okay, well, so thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be part of the series, as I mentioned to you before. So some of the arguments I'm going to present today are part of a published paper that came out last year. So that's the title of the paper that you see on the slide right now. And I think one of the main dilemma that marks the history of bioethics, or at least I should say more specifically, the ethical issues with research with human subjects, is this question about how we should balance the interest of individual research subjects with the collective's interests in the potential outcomes of research. I think that was like what a driving question in 20th century bioethics, and we've seen the development of codes of ethics and regulations in the 20th century. So the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and in the US specifically, the federal policy for the protection of human subjects are known as the Common Rule, that I'm sure many people here are very familiar with. So in the ethics of genome collections and biobanks specifically, that's the kind of research I'm going to be focusing on in my presentation today. The main worry is about informational privacy. And in that context, the dilemma, the way I see it, runs something like this. So either we make it so collecting, storing, and using biological data in biobanks is permitted, or we make it so that it is not permitted. On the one hand, if we do permit it, then we run the risk of failing to uphold our obligations concerning people's informational privacy. And if we do not permit it, then we run the risk of eschewing the future benefits of biomedical research. And therefore, we're stuck in this situation where either we risk failing to uphold certain obligations regarding people's privacy, or we risk eschewing future medical benefits. So again, here you have this kind of tension, the way it's usually framed between the interest of individuals and the collective's interest in the outcomes of research. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on premise 2 here that I bolded. In the paper, I actually look at arguments that have been made about the implications represented in premise 2 and premise 3, but for today, I'm going to focus again on premise 2. And if we want to talk about premise 3 in the Q&A, I'm happy to do so as well. Okay, so for research with live human beings, we have the Common Rule in the US. Well, this is for federally funded research, but the common rule, as well as, you know, the Declaration of Helsinki, Nuremberg Code, and other codes of ethics in other countries, they all emphasize the importance of having informed consent when you're performing research with live subjects. So what about research with a person's genetic data or biospecimens, cells, tissue, blood samples, etc.? What did the common rule say about this? Well, initially, the common rule said that if a researcher is performing so-called secondary research with a person's data or samples that has been stripped of any identifying information about that individual, then no consent is required. Okay. In the last decade, a decade-long conversation, I think, about this, some people thought it was time to update or make some changes to the common rule. And in 2015, there was a notice of proposed rulemaking that was published to ask for public comments about some proposals to update some parts of the common rule. And in that notice, this is a quote from that, one of the concerns was about this idea that when researchers conduct secondary research, no strict informed consent is required, again, if the samples are stripped of identifying information. So here I quote from this notice, continuing to allow secondary research with biospecimens collected without consent for research places the publicly funded research enterprise in an increasingly untenable position because it is not consistent with the majority of the public's wishes, which reflect legitimate autonomy interests, and most importantly, people just want to be asked for their permissions. So I think the sentiment that's expressed here in this passage, excuse me, is a reaction to a lot of sort of famous stories and legal cases that made the news or made headlines in the previous decades. So I'm thinking most specifically about the story of Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cells. Even legal cases like Moore versus the Regents of the University of California, the Havasupai tribe versus the Regents of Arizona State University. There are many more. A lot of these cases have share ethical issues in common, and some present unique challenges. But I think, the polls show that a lot of people do care about supporting biomedical research. They think it's important. And a lot of people are, or at least they express the sentiment that they would like to contribute to that enterprise somehow, but they feel uncomfortable when they hear stories of Henrietta Lacks and especially others who did not know researchers were using their data and samples, and then researchers or public or private institutions ended up making a profit off what they did with that person's biomaterials. So it rubs people the wrong way. And so the idea is that here, we want to maintain the public trust in this enterprise. People do care about it. People want to be asked for their permission. Okay. So during this time, where they were proposing changes to the common rule and asking for the public's comments, there were several proposals concerning first informed consent. So there were proposals to improve the informed consent procedures across the board with research with live subjects and obviously with secondary research. And a lot of those proposals about improving informed consent were accepted in the updated common rule that was implemented in 2018. I think it's interesting because it overlaps with some of the argument I'm going to make later in this presentation, but that's all I'll say about the change. I'm not going to talk about those changes for now. The second proposal that attracted many public comments was about this issue of secondary research and this idea that we ought to require informed consent to perform that secondary research with people's samples. That didn't get accepted. People now, when they collect data or samples, contributors, research subjects have to provide broad consent for future use. But if you're going to, provide, or if you have a research proposal using this data, again, or samples that are stripped of identifiers, you could request like a waiver of that, or a waiver of oversight, etc. But for the most part, this strict requirement to ask for informed consent every time that kind of research is done was not accepted. And apparently across the board in the public comments from different stakeholders expressed the concern that, this change would overburden researchers, overburden institutions that manage and oversee this research with these consent procedures for very negligible benefits. And apparently there was a lot of consensus about that. So that strong requirement for informed consent wasn't accepted in 2018. Still though, people started talking about new models of consent. And I just have a little meme here because I'm almost halfway through my slides and I think it's time for a little comedy. If you're a Coen Brothers fan, you'll appreciate it. But philosophers, especially ethicists, started to consider models of consent in this context, right? In the context of research with biobanks. Especially to reconsider what, if any, sense of confidentiality or anonymity should be promised to patients and research subjects, because I keep saying like, this stored data and biospecimens are stripped of identifying information, but given the nature of genetic information, there's been instances where de-identified or anonymized data have been de-anonymized or re-identified, and we could talk about that as well in the Q&A, but this is a growing concern, especially with biobanks who hold that kind of data. And then the other concern was this thought about broad consent or models of open blanket and broad consent. There are nuanced difference between those categories, but this idea is that, does that really respect the spirit of this concept of informed consent that was so central to 20th century bioethics for research with human subjects, in the sense of, if you're giving consent to researchers to do whatever they want to do with your data in the future, is that really informed? And if it's not informed, is it meaningful? So a lot of people thought, we need something a little stricter than this kind of broad consent. Another model that was proposed was tiered or categorical consent, which is the idea that, okay, well, you could ask a patient or a research subject what categories of types of research that they would want to contribute to or contribute their data to in the future. So a person might say, I really care about research that's trying to develop therapies for lung cancer specifically. So I'm gonna consent to that. But I have strong objections to any research that uses stem cells, for example. Okay, well, what if the future research project that's out there is proposing to develop a therapy for lung cancer using stem cells? So here it's, again, the idea is that it would, make this whole procedure very messy, overburden the people who are tasked with managing these kinds of consent procedures. It would seem that you would always need to have finer grain categories, or you risk violating people's consent or overlooking it, etc. And so some people pointed out that kind of concern with tiered consent. So instead of these kinds of static forms of consent, people said, well, hey, let's leverage the great emerging information and communication technologies that we have and develop a kind of dynamic consent for research in biobanks. And when I say, I said like broad consent, tiered consent, informed consent are like old static forms of consent. Is probably not the right word to use, because it's not like, even back then, it's not like a person said, I give consent to participate in research, and then the researcher could do anything they wanted, right? It's not static in that sense. The person could withdraw their consent at any time. But dynamic consent is this idea that we're going to leverage technology to have, research participants and research subjects be ongoing participants in this enterprise. Okay, this is finally where the promise of blockchain comes in. So it's assumed that, where we are in almost 2023, biomedical research and healthcare is dependent on these large sets of genetic and genomic data. They need all this data to discover genetic markers of health and disease, and they need that in turn to provide better diagnoses and patient-centered therapies, or this move towards personalized medicine. And again, this is arguable too, if this is like overstated or not. But it's a strong assumption that a lot of people have, especially in this area. So the idea is that it's imperative that we support, that we grow these biobanks and these genome collections. And obviously these biobanks and these collections are going to include very sensitive kinds of data, not just your, information about certain genes that you have, perhaps your whole genome, your phenotypic data, your medical records, your family histories, et cetera. So, the people who are tasked with managing this, they're already using ICTs, and they have to make sure that they manage this with care, with the utmost care. And so here comes this technology that was developed in the last decade that seems to provide the perfect solution, because blockchain, some of the defining qualities of blockchain applications is that they have really robust security features, but they allow for the flow of information, or they have these data sharing capacity. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next couple of slides just talking about a case study in consumer blockchain genomics as an example of a startup. I'm focusing on Nebula Genomics, not because it's the only one by any means. There are a lot of private and there are a lot of public institutions that are leveraging blockchain technology as well. But the reason I focus on them is that when they launched in 2018, I was just starting to research this topic, and they had published a white paper addressing specifically the ethical concerns around privacy, informational privacy, and these concerns in the context of biobanks. There are other models too, such as Luna DNA and EncryptGen, that are considered consumer blockchain genomic companies that are really interesting that we could talk about in the Q&A section as well. But Nebula was launched in 2018 famously by George Church, who I'm sure a lot of people here have heard about, and Kamal Obad and Dennis Grisham, the three people you see on the picture here. And if you go to their website now, they really do emphasize privacy in the kind of their business model, or how they sell themselves compared to other competitors. You'll see their slogan there, and they have a lot of graphics that emphasize that. But when they first launched, they had three stated goals. They wanted to accelerate the collection of genomic sequencing, because they thought like this is really crucial for the advancement of biomedical research and the innovations that we hope to get from that research in terms of treatments and care and therapies. They want to facilitate access to the data for researchers to be able to do their research using this decentralized secure network. And they also want to preserve individuals' privacy. That was like one of their important goals at the get-go. And in their white paper originally, they also said that the customers that would use Nebula services would retain ownership and control over their data and be compensated via credits or tokens on the company's blockchain. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. So why is this kind of new, since 23andMe and Ancestry.com have been around, for even longer, and a lot of people are familiar with them. I think around this time of year, you'll start seeing their commercials during the holiday season to buy their services. Well, importantly, when they first launched, they made a point of distinguishing themselves from other personal genetic companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. 23andMe, for example, their business model is that they sell genotyping services to their clients, and they retain ownership of the data. And of course, they ask for this kind of blanket consent from their clients, and with the client's consent, they then can sell the data to interested third parties, or in some instances, they used it themselves to perform some research. And 23andMe and Ancestry.com both they don't, sequence the whole genome. They provide at best an exome or, just SNPs or genes of interest, right? So they just do some, according to, I'm not sure if this is accurate, I would assume it is, but according to Nebula's website, 23andMe provides like 0.2 of the human genome. And, they're saying, well, we're going to provide whole genome sequencing. And they emphasize that because, again, the underlying assumption is having the whole genome is much better for research. I mean, having a collection of whole genomes is much better. Again, this is arguable. They also emphasize that unlike 23andMe, there's no intermediary between those who provide their data and those who want access to it. Okay, and then just quickly before I jump into my argument in the last 10 minutes, how it works. I'm not going to talk too much about the technical aspects. I'm not a computer scientist. We could talk about that in the Q&A. It is on a Blockstack platform, and at least in our white paper, they said they were using an Ethereum-derived blockchain. Importantly, the data access control is distributed among multiple parties. That means that multiple parties have access to the keys for the encrypted data. And all the requests for data and the consent to those requests for data that a participant would give are recorded on the blockchain. So they're transparent, immutable, tamper-proof, and auditable. Okay, so these are all the characteristics that's usually it goes with any blockchain app. That's why blockchain is so desirable or attractive in the healthcare context. Okay, but on more of a sort of business level, how it works, there is some difference between what I see now on their website to what I read in their white paper. And to be fair, I mean, the people who started this have been transparent about that. They admitted that their business model was going to evolve over time, which is normal depending how the markets develop for this kind of stuff. But now, if you go to a website, on the first page, if you kind of scroll down, it kind of looks a lot like 23andMe in the sense of you're going to be presented with a range of different kinds of testing kits that you could buy that come in the box that you see here on the slide. Then you order those, you get the box in the mail, you spit it in a tube, you send it back, and then you get access to their platform, you get access to all your raw data, and then you get access to some kind of analysis that Nebula performs, and the kind of analysis you get depends on the category that you buy. There's a price range of options. And then the idea is that participants would use Nebula's network to connect with interested parties who can then buy or rent their data for research and clinical use. And the transactions would be conducted with a sort of cryptocurrency or a token through the blockchain. Interestingly, another opportunity that was presented when they first started was that if people really wanted to have their whole genome sequenced, the cost is still like around $1,000 for that, or it was a few years ago, it keeps going down, but people didn't want to shell out the $1,000 right away, but they were interested in this kind of venture. What you could do is you could go on their platform and start filling out surveys and giving up some of your health data in that way. And these are like, again, the idea is all this health information is exchanged on a blockchain app. You could they even gave the option of like, if you use Fitbit devices or these kinds of devices that record lifestyle habits and health related habits, you can upload that raw data. They even have an option now where you can upload data if you've used 23andMe before of Ancestry.com. And the idea is that if you start giving up your data like that, you can earn credits or tokens, which you could then exchange eventually to get your whole genome sequenced and analyzed. Or if you start filling out these surveys and you have a really rare trait that a researcher is interested in, the researcher could also compensate you for that, or compensate you through paying for you to have your genome sequenced, and then your data is available to you. Okay, so there's all these different sorts of opportunities that a person has to interact with this kind of platform. Importantly, I'm just going to make this note now. Maybe people here have more information about this, so we could talk about it. But in the white paper and in some published papers, there was a lot of talk about developing a cryptocurrency or a token specific to Nebula. And on the website now, you don't really see that anymore compared to Encryptgen that still like emphasizes that, but I couldn't find it anywhere on their website recently. And I think it might be because there's still some questions about whether the SEC is going to regulate crypto or what kinds of crypto are they're going to regulate. And maybe they're just holding out to see how that goes before they update their business model. And LunaGen, interestingly, does care about compensation for individuals to provide their data. That they do it in a way that they give shares of their company to participants rather than crypto. They changed their model to do that as well. So we could talk more about this issue of compensation for providing your data for research in the Q&A as well. But to go back to the second premise here, Nebula, as an example, seems confident in their proposals that they could improve the generation and management of genomic databases and provide a sort of technological fix to the problem that permitting the growth of genome collections put people's privacy at risk. Okay, so is this the solution to the ethical concerns about privacy? I'm gonna answer no. At least it's not an exhaustive solution to the ethical concerns we have about informational privacy. And I want to be clear that I'm not going to be arguing that against what Nebula Genomics is proposing. I'm not going to claim that they're unethical in any sense. I mean, they might be, but I don't think they are. I think their proposal is kind of neat. So that's not where my argument is going. I'm just saying that the technological fix alone will not give us all the answers to our ethical concerns. Okay, so I think I might go a little longer than 30 minutes, maybe 35. I think I have about 10 minutes left. And so I'm just going to give you an outline of one of the arguments that I make in that paper now. So let's go back to this idea of having a right to informational privacy. I kind of said it implicitly in a few slides that what that means, I mean, this is the concern in the ethics of biobank and genome collections and this kind of research, right? This is what people care about. And that right is the right that people have to exercise control over who gets access to their personal data, right? And that right is valuable because I quote from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, the report in 2015, because it's fundamental to establishing and maintaining one's identity, well-being, and autonomy. And I want to claim it's not valuable merely because it protects individuals from certain violations or interference in their decisions. Okay, there are a lot of philosophers have made arguments about the value of informational privacy, especially in not just in bioethics, but in computer ethics, information ethics specifically. So we could talk about that in the Q&A as well. But I think this is this quote by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics is a good starting point for us today. In traditional bioethics, biomedical research with human subjects, I mentioned that informed consent is the gold standard to make sure that a subject's autonomy is respected. And I talked about these different models of consent briefly before. This is a table that I took from Laura Beskow's paper, really great paper on called Lessons from HeLa Cells. She goes over these different models of consent. But in this context, especially with something like Nebula Genomics, we're focusing on dynamic consent. Okay. And dynamic consent, the kind of upshot of that is that a lot of people think it does maintain that spirit of the traditional informed consent model. It's importantly, without overburdening researchers or exhausting limited resources on managing these consent and reconsent procedures, because we're leveraging this technology that we have. This is all consistent with Nebula's claim that enabling a process of dynamic control via this kind of distributed network can help to address concerns about people's rights to informational privacy. I want to suggest, though, that this might place other undue burdens on research participants who lack expertise in the biomedical research enterprise as a whole, like the process of it, or even in sort of biology or the science itself, or give them too much responsibility in the management of their sensitive health-related data. Now, this is not a novel point. I'm not the first person to make this point. Other people have pointed that out when talking about the models of dynamic consent. But I want to suggest that this kind of burden might hint at a reason to doubt that growing genome collections through a blockchain will be successful at establishing and maintaining one's autonomy and really reflect the value of informational privacy. Okay, so here's the kind of crux of my argument, and then I'll kind of tease it out a little bit more. So if we have a right to informational privacy, I think that means that there are corresponding obligations that other people have to make sure that the right bearer is not, it does have that right, right? So any right imposes obligations on others. So let's suppose that the moral obligation of upholding individuals' right to informational privacy in this context means that one ought to contribute to establishing and maintaining individuals' autonomy. Right? Not just refrain from doing something, but actually positively do something. I want to say that the moral obligation might require more from us than mere non-interference with people's decisions about their data. And here's the crux. And again, this is like, I don't know if there are any philosophers here, but this is very abstract and I'll unpack it in a second. But I want to claim that it might minimally require that the moral agent realizes a situation in which a moral patient finds it easy to act on principled reasons. And because the moral agent should also care that the moral patient acts on the best principled reasons available, the moral agent should also promote the capacities for acting on the best principled reason. Okay, so this is very abstract. And if you're with me still, you might, the first question that comes up is it plausible that we have such obligations, positive obligations to help establish and maintain another person's autonomy? And who has such obligations in this context, and to whom are data owed, right? Those are the questions. So I don't really answer the second question. I suggest an answer to it. And again, we could talk about it in the Q&A, but I want to answer affirmatively the first one. I want to say, like, I think it is plausible that we have such a positive obligation. To sort of explain a little more what I mean about realizing a situation where a moral patient finds it easy to act on principled reasons, and hopefully the best principled reason, we have to go back to, these concepts, these kind of fundamental concepts in normative ethics that we use and we apply in applied ethics. So I'm thinking about autonomy in this Kantian sense versus a Millian sense of liberty. So let me just say quickly a little more about that. In Kant's moral philosophy, there are, I think, two senses of autonomy. There's a thick Kantian sense of autonomy where a person's decision is autonomous when and only when it is made on the basis of reason alone. Yeah, a lot of people think that this is a part with Kant where they kind of get off the boat because they think it's too strong. But the idea here is that if a person acts or decides to act based on a desire or what Kant calls natural inclination or natural instincts, then they're acting heteronymously rather than autonomously if they're not acting on a principled reason. So for Kant, like having the capacity to act autonomously is pretty much the same as being a rational person, and being a rational person is what's required to be a moral person. There's a thinner sense of Kantian autonomy too that's reflected in Kant's formula of humanity, the third formulation of the categorical imperative. And this is, I'm sure if people here have taught philosophical bioethics or introductory to bioethics courses, this is very intuitive for most students to get, right? Kant just tells us, don't treat other people as mere means to your own end. So because persons as a category, those who have the capacity to act autonomously, are end setters, they can send their own end, they deserve a kind of like respect and dignity because they have this kind of status. And so other people should not use them, should not deceive them, should not coerce them towards like achieving their own ends, right? You can enlist the help of people to achieve your own ends only if they consent. You can't coerce or deceive people. So this is, again, it overlaps with Mill's idea of liberty, because this thinner sense of Kantian autonomy is kind of consistent with this, like, don't interfere with other people's choices, with other rational persons' choices. And Mill's idea of liberty, at least in his work on liberty, not his work on free will and this other concepts of liberty, but when he's talking about this kind of political liberties, he's concerned with, inappropriate interference from the state specifically when he's writing about this. But it doesn't have anything much to do with acting on principled reasons in this thick Kantian sense. All right, so I think if you're with me so far with this kind of strict Kantian or strong, thick notion of autonomy and this idea of liberty, I think it's really important that both are valued in ethical discussions of data management and research in biobanks in general. But I think there's a trade-off between the two that needs to be acknowledged. And so I think too great an emphasis on the strong Kantian sense of autonomy can be restricting, right? Because they're saying, not every reason for acting counts. But too great an emphasis on liberty can lead to suboptimal outcomes. And I'm going to quote here from this, I think, really great paper by Kogan and Miola, published in 2011 on this idea of autonomy in medical decision-making. But they say too great a concern for rationality, and you could replace rationality here with strong Kantian autonomy. Essentially, it debars many people from having the power of choice and narrows further the available options from amongst which to choose. But too great a concern with liberty, by contrast, leaves everyone hostage to unwisdom. And I really like this phrase, leaves everyone hostage to his wisdom. I kind of borrowed this in my paper. I think this captures this idea that our individual choices, uncoerced, might lead to suboptimal outcomes for the collective. And so again, to bring it back a little bit to biobank research, these are, admittedly artificial and simplistic examples, but it might kind of help to illustrate what I have in mind here. So let's say individuals provide their data to, let's say, pharmaceutical companies for what they individually desire without much thought, rather than put a bit more thought to it and provide data to researchers addressing more pressing public health concerns that we have at the moment. So that might lead to a certain kind of suboptimal outcome. Or a situation in which individuals provide their data to, either public or private institution, probably, let's say, a private institution, to develop a therapy for really pressing public health concerns. So imagine 3 years ago for COVID vaccines or treatment, but the companies, kind of, not surprisingly, don't distribute those therapies fairly, or to those who need them the most, or to the least worse off, for example, right? That might lead to a suboptimal outcome. Or more generally, you can even envision a situation where people contribute their data or their samples uncoerced in any way, but that has a significant impact on the pursuit of research, what kind of research gets prioritized, and in the real world with limited resources, that might lead to suboptimal outcomes as well. So I'm just going to wrap up here. So I think I want to claim that there is a case to be made for an obligation to prevent individuals from not acting on the best principled reasons, to avoid being in a situation where everyone is hostage to an unwisdom, right, to these suboptimal outcomes. And so I think we should not encourage the average individual to make decisions about their personal health-related data based on their idiosyncratic desires, but instead, we should promote their exercise of their autonomy in this strong Kantian sense. And if we accept that there is such an obligation, then here's the biggest challenge. How do we do this? How do we balance that sense of autonomy without giving up too much on liberty, right? Because I said there is a trade-off. It's not like I want to do away with liberty, and so I do want to maintain a minimal interference in people's choices. Okay, I think I have one more slide here, but I think it's just summing up what I said. So just to bring it back to Nebula really quickly. So I think although ventures like Nebula seem to support the claim that they can uphold obligations concerning people's rights to informational privacy from interference, at least, my claim is that that's not the only issue at stake when we consider the value of informational privacy and its role in establishing and maintaining a person's autonomy. Informational privacy is valuable to individuals not merely for the sake of protecting their liberty, but importantly to establish and maintain and promote the exercise of their capacity to act on principled reasons. Okay, I'll stop there. I have a conclusive slides, but it's just what I already said. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, Valerie, thank you so much. Lots of provocative material. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So I'll just keep a queue. If people want to raise their hands or send me a note in the chat. Annette, what you got? Annette's giving you applause. Thank you, Annette. So anybody have a question that they want to start off with? So I guess if not, Shelley, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I was just gathering my thoughts, so apologize if I'm all over the place. Thank you, Valerie. It was super, super interesting, and I'm working on very similar topics, so it was very interesting to hear what you had to say. I think so. I have, let's say, I think 3 questions maybe. So feel free to kind of ignore 1 or 2 questions if we don't have time. I think so. The first question that I wanted to ask you is, I understand, after hearing the presentation, is that you are trying to do a lot of balancing work, right? To try to balance the autonomy versus the liberty, to try to balance the individual interest compared to, the interest to promote scientific advances, etc. But to me, the way I'm reading it is the starting point is the individual and the individual interests. And that focuses mostly on the personal kind of aspect of genetic material and information. And I was wondering what you think about, how the uniqueness of genetic material and information are reflected in your, in your thoughts about these issues, because obviously each genetic material and information have also familial aspects, also have collective aspects. So understanding genetic material and information only from the perspective of the individual, right, the personal aspect, it's kind of the unique information about the individual. So I'm wondering what you think about the other aspects and how do you think they should be kind of taken into account. The second question that I had, it's perhaps maybe a suggestion or more than a question. You are trying to argue about a more positive obligation to individuals' rights. And I was wondering if you have thoughts about more theoretical foundations for these positive obligations. For instance, one of the ideas that I thought about is to think about these entities more in terms of fiduciaries, and perhaps to think about every entity that has some power over genetic material and information has this kind of fiduciary duty toward the individual. And the last question, which is related to that, do you think, I'm wondering if you think there are other contexts in which your proposal should be applied to, not only the research, but more systemically all entities that engage with activity related to genetic material and information. Sorry for taking all the time.
No, that's so great. I mean, there's so much in what you just said, so I kind of don't know where to start. Okay, let's see. So to start, let's start when I talked about the different models of consent under negotiation in the context of this kind of research and biobank research and genomic research. I talked about blanket consent, broad consent, tiered consent. It's all consent, right? And I forgot who the authors are now, but if you're interested, I could find a reference for you. And I've been thinking about this, but some people said, well, maybe it's time to like step away from this emphasis we put on consent in these kinds of discussions and focus more on this issue of solidarity and this kind of contractual basis that is the nature of the research relationship when you're using live subjects or people's samples. And I think that's consistent with my focus of saying like, let's stop looking at rights so much and let's look at obligations. And that includes the obligations that individual contributors, research subject, research participants have to contribute to this public good. And obviously, and in my presentation, I talked about that category as moral patience mostly to make my point, but I think they also have positive obligations in that sense. And then who are the moral agents that I'm thinking about? Well, it could include Nebula themselves and the people who are involved in these like private startups, but it could be, ethicists, policymakers, lawyers, all of us perhaps, we might have that obligation to ensure that individuals maintain their or uphold their obligations to contribute to that public good as well. And then, one thing I had in mind was that in the recently updated Common Rule in 2018, one of the changes that they made in written informed consent procedures for research with live subjects is this part of the form, because a lot of the criticisms of the status quo back then a few years ago was that informed consent forms were so filled with so much jargon, so long that it's more like concerns about the liability of researchers than really providing information to obtain actually informed consent. So they proposed several changes that were accepted at that. And one of that is that now the procedures have to include arguments for why a reasonable person might want to participate in whatever the endeavor they're considering and why they might not want to participate in that. So I think that's like a kind of concrete example of how I think one might fulfill their positive obligations that I've been talking about today. So maybe something like that in terms of like, okay, well, so you have your raw data, you have it like stored somewhere in this platform, and then, a researcher reaches out to you, and then someone in Nebula has to do the work of presenting arguments for and against to help that person make the decision in a way that's understandable and accessible language, et cetera. So that might be a concrete way of spelling out that obligation. And that's the kind of positive obligation that I see, like how it would unfold in like real life, right? Or in a concrete way. I think part of that could, because you mentioned something about the issue with genetic and genomic data specifically is that one's genome also carries information about their family members and others, right? And so when you're making decisions, autonomous decisions, they affect others in serious ways, or they can, right? This is one of the concerns about when Henrietta Lacks's genome was fully sequenced a few years ago, right? So that might be a concern that's spelled out for people when they're helped in their deliberations of how they should manage or how they should contribute their data, right? So make people aware of that as well. I'm not sure if I answered all your questions now. Did I miss anything important? I think I want to say something about, I get the pushback a lot about, this kind of like, well, it's really hard to make the case for positive obligations, negative obligations, like not doing things to people is a lot easier to argue for and probably to enforce legally. I'm hoping lawyers here might have to say something about that. And I think, and some people doubt that positive rights or positive obligations actually exist at all. I'm not one of those people, obviously, I think they do. but I think it might be unlikely in this context that they might take precedence over, our negative obligations in terms of the concerns about liberty. I'm not sure, but but again, and I'm also not the kind of person who thinks that negative obligations always trump positive obligations. I think there's all these kinds of circumstances that one can imagine where it's like pretty obviously in that case, the positive obligation would take precedence. So I could say more about that, but I don't know if anyone has more questions. Did I answer your main concerns?
Yeah, thank you.
So I guess I'll jump in and ask a quick question that kind of builds on that. So as somebody with experience in law, but no special experience in philosophy, I think part of the disconnect between how sort of legally trained people, meaning legal scholars as well as practicing lawyers, might think about the question you just posed. So one of the sort of the challenges of focusing on obligations is not simply the conceptual question of do positive obligations exist, but the practical question of can they be enforced, is that lawyers would look at that question and try to situate it in one of a small number of very conventional categories. Does it exist as a matter of contract law? Does it exist as a matter of property law? Does it exist as a matter of some other kind of traditional core category of law? And all of those traditional core categories resolve to individuals. There is no good, well-established legal syntax for thinking about collective interests and community interests outside of a small number of boxes. So the entire time you were giving your presentation, Valerie, I was thinking about how in the information technology world, people who develop and are proponents of open source computer software programs have struggled over 25, 30 years worth of those programs being practically speaking robust and widely used. What's the legal justification for enforcing obligations consistent with open source creativity and open source contribution? So, what if you contribute code to an open source project and then somebody else comes along and appropriates code that's inconsistent with the terms of the open source community? And what do you do? And the answer is the legal system kind of throws up its hands and just says, well, basically, we trust that won't happen. And there's a very small number of unsatisfying cases that have been litigated to try to resolve that. So I think where you're going, if I understand what you're saying, is that from a philosophical standpoint, there are good reasons to question the historical focus on consent as the sort of the ethical foundation for all of our concern about individuals and privacy. And the blockchain technology sort of reveals the limitations of that model without giving us a really robust alternative. So that's kind of where I am. So here's the question. Have you thought about how your thinking might be extended to legacy data? So Nebula is, for example, and other companies are in the business of soliciting people to contribute genomic information at the present time and constructing databases out of that. But there's an enormous amount of individualized clinical data circulating in databases going back a generation or two, not all of which is genomic in character, but all of which is potentially medically useful. And what do we do about that from the standpoint of constructing a robust, justifiable, philosophical foundation for, making good, productive social use of that while protecting, appropriately protecting the dignity of individuals?
Yeah, that's a hard one. Thank you. That's a great one, and I like your analogy with the issue of open source, because isn't there a kind of a category of copyright now, or called copyleft, that kind of
well,
helps
in legal terms, that's kind of an invention. That's kind of an imaginative invention. It's not really a formally recognized category.
Okay. It's not enforced, but I was thinking about something like that with legacy data in the genomic settings. But yeah, but the problem with you're talking about two different, essentially different kinds of things, right? Open source code is much different than a person's genomic data. So I don't know if I have an answer to that. I mean, there are people who have emphasized that the human genome shouldn't be owned, right? It's what's the phrase again? It's like the heritage of humanity. I think, is that the phrase? I'm sure people, something along those lines, right? That's so no one ought to own it or treat it like a property in any way, right? It's not mine. My genomic data is not mine any more than it would be 23andMe if I used their services or anyone else's. I don't know if that could be enforced or kind of protected by the law. It is interesting though, because a lot of these consumer genomic ventures, consumer genetic ventures, I mentioned a little bit how, I mean, it's not on their website now so much, but as at the start, Nebula Genomics emphasized this this other upshot of leveraging blockchain technology, other than facilitating data sharing and kind of privacy and the security aspects, was this opportunity to be compensated for contributing this information or remunerated. They don't really talk about that anymore on their website, but it is in their published papers. But interestingly, I mentioned Luna DNA says, I forgot what it is in their exactly the wording on their website, but they say, we don't want you to sell your genomic data, or genomic data shouldn't be sold, it should be shared. Yet you still should get some compensation for almost, I mean, I'm putting words here in their mouths, but individuals should get, perhaps recognition or some kind of compensation for contributing to this public good by, in their model, is that they give you shares of the company that they have, right? But they don't give you any kind of crypto or token, whereas EncryptGen actually says, sell your data. Your data is so valuable to research, you should get a cut too, right? They say that explicitly. Again, I'm paraphrasing here, but if you look at their website, they talk about that too. So if we do think that it's not a category that should be considered property at all, then we would have to argue that perhaps these kinds of private ventures shouldn't exist in the first place.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a little bit like giving people Starbucks cards to just motivate them to participate in the collective project. The last thing I would just suggest is that on this note, there's a different part of Kant when he was writing about copyright, not something that he is usually celebrated for or associated with, but he did write about copyright. And his contribution, which turns out to be quite influential in some indirect ways, was to draw a fairly sharp distinction between knowledge, or what in modern IP law we would call ideas. In Kant's framing, knowledge could not be owned, right? So there's a social interest, obviously, in free circulation of knowledge, and the specific expression of the knowledge today, we would say that's the copyrightable material. So there's a sense, I don't know enough about Kantian philosophy to link all these different pieces together, but I suspect that you or others could construct a Kantian case for your alternative vision of sort of collectively grounded obligations rather than individuated sort of entitlements. So again, I'm just speculating on the fly, motivated by what you're describing. I don't know if any of this resonates with you, Valerie.
No, I mean, that's an interesting connection that I haven't really thought about. I know that the whole Kantian line of argument for why, the copyright law, like, so ideas should be exchanged freely, but the expression of ideas what's protected under a copyright law. And I think the Kantian would say, if it wouldn't, right, then you're using another person as a mere means, right? Their labor that they engaged in to produce that expression of the specific idea is what is protected by copyright, and that what they have a rightful ownership to. And I think this is like the same kind of idea that we've seen for like gene patents, for cell line, like patents on cell lines, like the Moore case, where it was like, well, it's not just the fact that Moore had really interesting cells that produce proteins that helped boost the immune system, right, naturally, and then this doctor just stole those cells and then it's because the doctor did do something to create an immortal cell line that were then actually useful for research and treatment, and that's the expression of the idea. Although like the protein itself is not anyone's property.
Yeah,
right? So I think there's the kind of analogy there, but I'm not sure how it would work with. I mean, you could still make the case in terms of like the whole sequence of a person's genome is probably not that useful before it's analyzed, right? Or before it's like, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a biomedical researcher, but there again, people argue about this because a lot of people, obviously, in the last 10 years or 20 years, we now know that so-called junk DNA is not so much junk DNA as people kind of assumed in the early 2000s. And we're discovering more about, we still know very little about how genes are regulated and how the genome itself as a complex system is expressed, et cetera. So, but again, yeah, so I don't know, again, if that would mean that genomes, yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, it may be that, and we know this in other respects, intellectual property law does not answer all the questions that we would like it to answer. And data are a very imperfect analogy to the material that we typically think being associated either with copyright or with patents. So it's not necessarily wise to go too far down this path in terms of the specifics. That said, I think we need to call this to a close for today. It's a little bit past the top of the hour. So Valerie, I want to thank you very much for a very, very provocative and interesting and timely presentation. And I appreciate your joining us from your remote location. Thanks to everybody for being with us today. It's always great to see such a diverse group of people from representing such a range of interests and disciplines. We have one more talk coming up in the series this fall, also in the area of bioethics and bioinformation, facilitated by Lisa Parker as well. So that information will be on the website, and look forward to staying in touch with everybody and continuing to engage on all these subjects. So Brian, at this point, I think it's safe to stop the recording.